This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. This time tomorrow, my body composition will be 61% sparkling wine, so let's enjoy this show while I'm still sharp. Here's what we got for y'all. Georgia is being hit with a wave of misinformation ahead of their January Senate runoff races. We'll tell you what's being said and how social media is playing a role in how the misinformation is spreading. Plus, we're administering a dose of truth to help you separate fact from fiction when it comes to COVID vaccines. But first, here's what you need to know right now. Colorado made headlines as the first US state to identify a case of the new COVID-19 variant from the United Kingdom, known as B117. Remember, mutations are completely normal behavior for a virus, and scientists say the vaccines we have are still effective. But here's the real kicker. The virus was detected in a man in his 20s with no travel history. That means the new variant could already be spreading in the US. In a statement, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said it expects additional cases with the variant to appear in the coming days.
It's certainly possible that somebody traveled to Great Britain or to New York or to California. We actually don't know that it's not already in other parts of the United States or other parts of the world. I would say almost with certainty it is, because this is just what viruses do.
Scientists in the UK say B117 is more contagious, which means it could spread easier, but there's no evidence to say it's likely to lead to a more severe COVID case.
I actually think we've now moved beyond waves or surges, and this is a viral tsunami that we are now experiencing.
We're continuing to set records when it comes to coronavirus cases in the US. On Tuesday, more than 3,700 COVID deaths were recorded, and according to the COVID Tracking Project, the US also set a record for new hospitalizations, with more than 124,000 patients. In California, restrictions and lockdowns were extended until mid-January in 2 large regions, as ICU beds continue to fill up.
In the past, maybe it's like throwing matches into the woods. Occasionally you have a little bit of flare up, a little outbreak of COVID, let's say. But now we're seeing in California a raging viral wildfire of disease.
Experts say it's still going to get worse before it gets better. With more than 1 million people passing through security checkpoints on Monday alone, holiday travel is likely to contribute to even higher caseloads in the coming weeks. While vaccinations offer us a glimmer of hope, vaccine distribution isn't going as smoothly or as quickly as hoped. In other words, this portion of Operation Warp Speed is crawling along. The Trump administration promised 20 million doses would be administered before January, but the CDC says just over 2 million doses have been given to Americans so far. That means, among other things, masks will still be a fashion statement and a necessity in 2021. We've gotten developments in 2 high-profile cases where police have shot and killed Black people. In Louisville, 2 police officers who were a part of the raid that led to the death of Breonna Taylor were terminated, including the officer who fired the fatal shot that killed Taylor. Earlier this year, outrage exploded when a grand jury only indicted 1 officer for firing shots into a neighboring apartment, not Taylor's. Today's move marks an acknowledgement from the police department that there were serious missteps and violations that night back in March, but that's still a far cry from what the family has continued to ask for: criminal charges for the officers involved. In Cleveland, it was a different story for the family of Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy who was killed by Cleveland police officers in 2014 while carrying a pellet gun. After a 5-year inquiry, the Department of Justice says it found no evidence supporting federal criminal charges against the 2 officers who responded to the scene. According to the New York Times, back in August, a lawyer filed a whistleblower complaint with the DOJ's Inspector General, accusing the department of mishandling the case. Now the federal statute of limitations on key charges being considered have expired.
Yeah, it's going on 6 years, and it's heartbreaking. Heartbreaking. Just a sweet little boy. I promise you he was.
The election season is almost over. We're just waiting on Georgia. Also, apologies to everyone in the state still in the thick of it. Georgia voters will head to the polls to weigh in on a pair of runoff races that will decide which party controls the Senate. But before the January election date, the state is being hit with a wave of election-related mis- and disinformation. Newsy's Tyler Adkison takes a look at the common narratives and how social media is playing a role in the spread.
Georgia is being flooded with election misinformation ahead of its Senate runoff races, with much of it focused on voter fraud.
a couple of different threads. The idea that the election itself was not reliable and that a future election will not be reliable. This is part of a Georgia-specific narrative, but also part of a larger narrative, particularly around the presidential election in the swing states.
Social media has been a main source of the mis and disinformation. According to nonpartisan research organization Advanced Democracy, as of early December, Twitter has seen an average 1.5 million posts a day on the Georgia runoff race. Of the top 10 hashtags used in tweets about Georgia, half have implied voter fraud. Those claims haven't been supported by evidence, but efforts to correct this false election content on social media haven't been robust. Human rights group Avaz analyzed 200 Facebook posts with misinformation about the Georgia election and found that 60% did not receive fact-checking labels. Avaz also found a small group of people close to President Trump are using their social media presence to spread election misinformation, including his son Eric Trump and right-wing commentator Mark Levin. Runoff candidates have been the source of false information spreads, too.
What we find with the candidates is that they are repeating the claims or the attacks that they make. So they might first appear in a TV ad, but then the attacks will be repeated on Twitter or in an interview or another media.
For instance, Senator Kelly Loeffler has repeatedly made the claim that Democrat Raphael Warnock wants to open up prisons by eliminating cash bail, when in reality he wants to do sentencing reform. Warnock has also falsely accused Loeffler of doing an interview with a white supremacist on One American News Network, a claim that was debunked by PolitiFact. Platforms are actively trying to clamp down on these false claims, though. Facebook says it will label content that tries to delegitimize voting in the Georgia runoff elections, like claims that say that vote by mail leads to fraud. Twitter says it labels or removes false information about how to participate in the election. Sturgill said that while these debunking efforts may help, efforts to spread misinformation about the election may spread further and stick with people more than the corrective information.
There's going to be too many efforts to spread bad information to have technical solutions that work well and work consistently. Those first impressions that they get, they kind of tend to stick. So even if it's something that gets sent and you see it one time and it turns out to later be proven false, you may not see the debunking later that will happen.
Experts say you should do a gut check whenever you see a fact that sparks a strong emotional response. Tyler Adkisson, Newsy, Chicago.
Just keep in mind, the election season will be over. Eventually. One day, hopefully. Prayerfully. I think. Earlier in the year, the Paycheck Protection Program was set up to provide loans for struggling businesses. In theory, it was exactly what businesses needed to stay afloat, but the execution was flawed, and billions went to larger than intended businesses. National reporter Alicia Nieves shows us what's different this time around and how smaller businesses are being prioritized to receive federal dollars.
I always had a dream of starting an urban farm.
Timothy Smith has spent the last few years working toward that dream, finally transitioning from being a teacher to an urban farmer last year.
By October of 2019, we had a mayor's ribbon cutting with Mayor Marty Walsh.
We Grow Microgreens was off to a great start. The new neighborhood greenhouse had quick demand for its more aromatic and nutrient-packed vegetables. A half dozen part-time workers were hired, with plans to make them full-time soon. But the pandemic hit, and the impact was instant.
We had a number of loyal customers that would continue to purchase at farmers markets. That being said, a large percentage of our customers were restaurants. We lost a lot of that business.
The Boston-based small business applied for a PPP loan under the CARES Act and was surprised to only get approved for $810. Even more surprised to see large businesses getting millions. In fact, data released by the Small Business Administration shows more than $250 billion went to larger than intended businesses.
I just hope that in the next round, they really consider some of the upstarts like us and some of the very small businesses that also need to survive.
Well, I'm optimistic that this money will get out relatively soon and much more to companies that really need it than the last time.
Todd McCracken is with the National Small Business Association and says the latest round of PPP loans has new provisions that do aim to ensure the money actually goes to more small businesses like We Grow Microgreens. For example, a business has to prove a drop in revenue in one quarter of 2020, ensuring struggling businesses only get this money and get it first. There's a provision that a business with more than 300 employees no longer qualifies for the forgivable loans, one where the government has lowered the maximum loan amount to $2 million, and a new rule that larger chains no longer qualify for PPP money.
The other thing they've done that we're not sure how it's going to play out is they've done set-asides for small companies. So there's a pool of money specifically for companies with fewer than 10 employees that only they can tap.
If new provisions work as intended, small businesses like this urban farm to millions more around the country can rehire workers, move part-timers to full-time, and help employees who have also struggled through this pandemic. I'm Alicia Nieves reporting.
We're going to do a little myth busting when you're back. If someone told me the Venn diagram of journalism and myth busting in 2020 would be a complete circle, I might have dressed the part, like the other Mythbusters host, Jamie Heineman. Look at that beret. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and with vaccines rolling out, there are a lot of questions about these vaccines, like, are they used for population control? Newsy's Amber Strong dives into that theory in our new series, Dose of Truth.
There's a lot of false information around about the two leading COVID-19 vaccines in the U.S. We wanted to provide the facts and answer some questions. I'm not a doctor, but know a few. We asked, is the vaccine being introduced in Africa as a means of population control?
The vaccine is not being introduced in Africa, especially not to control the population.
There is a history of using various experiments and trials in communities of color, which include, unfortunately, times in which sterilization and, what some have deemed efforts of genocide have occurred throughout history as it relates to medicine. And so that's where this notion comes from. What we have to promote and educate is that we've come a long way from that. We have regulatory and legal aspects in place to prevent repeating of history.
People may be surprised or maybe even uncomfortable when they hear things like we need to ensure that that Black and Brown communities are vaccinated first. And the reason why there is a discussion about people from these communities being able to have first access to the vaccine is because the Black and Brown communities are disproportionately impacted.
Show of hands, how many of y'all are ready to go back to the office? Honestly, I don't know why I do that because I can't see y'all, but I imagine there are quite a few of you ready to put on a proper pair of trousers and head back to wherever you work. That'll require a lot of planning on the front end to satisfy COVID protocols and precautions. National reporter Stephanie Stone spoke to an HR firm who says it can be done safely with everyone's help.
Do you want to go back to work? It's a loaded question, but in a recent survey, 63% of workers said it's time.
People are ready for a return to the office. 91% of respondents were ready for return if the office was at 50% capacity or less. We also learned that there were certain safety measures people really were okay with.
Jason Miller is CEO of PromoLeaf, an online promotional products distributor.
This is, I think, our third or fourth survey since COVID started, all the way from, events being canceled and hosting virtual events to weddings being canceled, hosting virtual weddings. We just ran a survey on remotely hiring employees and onboarding them and understanding what a remote hire really looks for when they're hired.
Miller said their latest survey, which asked people about going back to the office, was an effort to understand what's next for many industries, his included.
This was kind of the next natural evolution, was understanding how people felt about returning to the workplace. and in-person meetings.
I know people want to get back to work, but when you put it in those terms of all the things that need to be done in order to get an employee back to work, then it sort of seems like, well, is it even worth it? Because that is a lot of work.
We think about, okay, what's the benefit and what's the risk? And there are ultimately some companies who feel like there is a larger risk if they keep employees at home.
Eric Machnez is a senior consultant for Red Clover, an HR management and consulting firm.
We help offices make sure that they are compliant with laws, HR policies, et cetera, best practices. But then we also try to help them build and grow their interview process, their performance development process, to really set their organization apart from others in the industry.
And these days, they're helping get the office ready for employees to come back in.
We've had employees who've identified to us that their ability to return to the office would actually be less stressful than being at home, because they're at home with their spouse who's also working from home. They're potentially handling remote learning with their children at home. And I also think there's something about one's ability to be productive while they're surrounded by their family.
It's no secret that working from home is both great and difficult. Machnez says employers have to figure out what's best for their workforce. Federal and local health guidelines must be followed. Things like limited capacity, reassigned workspaces, signage, and a plan if employees are exposed or sick.
And it can be done to the extent that everyone's following policies as it relates to their return to work. And I also think there's a level of personal responsibility that people need to take when they're outside of the office. And that is one of the bigger and more difficult challenges facing a lot of businesses right now.
A sign that it can be done, but while these conversations are being had right now, it depends on the field you work in. And for some, there's still a long way to go before everyone's both comfortable and COVID safe in the office. I'm Stephanie Stone, reporting.
If you haven't done so already, feel free to holler at us on Twitter using the hashtag #NewsyInTheLoop. It's not too late to admit I'm your news crush for this year. Or just another punchable face on your TV screen. We've spent a lot of time inside this year, and if you're like me, that's giving you time to take stock of your habits, like how you recycle. I'll admit, I'll see an item and think, looks like recycling, without really checking it out. And I know I'm not alone. Newsy's Stephanie Sandoval tells us more about how poorly we've been recycling and how that affects what happens to our waste.
Recycling is no easy task.
Sometimes we'll get raccoons.
It can be messy.
We'll get things like this in there.
And dangerous.
Little propane tanks. No gas in it, but still.
Nick Paul is no stranger when it comes to recycling.
What they're going to try to do is get as much cardboard off before it gets off the line. I've been recycling most of my life. When I went in the military, we recycled on every base I was on.
Most Americans have access to curbside recycling, but just because you toss an item in the recycling bin doesn't mean it'll get recycled, especially if they're contaminated with food particles. According to the EPA, only about 32% of what Americans throw in recycling is recycled.
A lot of consumers really do want to recycle, but they can be kind of confused about how to best do that.
The biggest mistake is they mix the material together like if you have cardboard and you have containers, we'd rather leave the cardboard and containers separated. If you're I'm on the fiber line and containers come up, they end up getting thrown in the trash. Because we don't have time to take the stuff, re-separate it from trash and the containers.
That's why Jenny Romer wrote a book called Can I Recycle This? The book digs into America's recycling system, how to recycle better, and how to reduce single-use plastic. It comes out in April of next year.
There's so much that I think the public doesn't know
about how recycling works.
For instance, not everything can be recycled, and depending on where you live, recycling rules can differ quite a bit.
People think of that they put a container or something in their recycling bin and it's magically turned into another product.
There has to be a purchaser at the end in order for something to be truly recycled.
It doesn't really become recycled until a manufacturer purchases that item and turns it into another, bottle or container.
She says she sees a lot of low-value plastic waste. In fact, only about 9% of plastic ever produced has been recycled.
So a lot of really inexpensive single-use plastic doesn't have a buyer that wants to purchase it. So, no matter how much time you spend really carefully washing and sorting all of those little pieces of plastic that you buy, a lot of the time, if they're not the right resin, if they're too small, then no one's going to purchase them on the other end, and they're going to go to landfill. The 3 through 7 plastics are worth only about $20 a ton, but the HDPE bottles and jugs are worth over $1,000 a ton.
A few tips: buy products with recycled content, reduce the use of single-use plastic, and check your community's recycling rules.
There isn't going to be the demand for more recycled content unless there's a supply.
Stephanie Sandoval.
Keep recycling.
Newsy.
That's it for us, gang. As always, thanks for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with our last In the Loop episode of the year, and I'll be joined by some of my good friends. You can do what you want, but you'll really dig this one. Tomorrow, same time, same place. More top stories from Newsy are headed your way right now.